Good morning. We have Jeffrey Bolden of Blue Lotus Systems Integration Data Conversion. He's a big data expert. We have Frederick Baker, a man who has 20 years experience in finance and is a political theorist. We have Scott Licamelli, a Russian area expert and the senior vice president of Sun Fund Renewables, and Gennady Sklarevsky, Professor Emeritus from Bard College. I'm McGrady, your host, and today we're talking about the specter of war, a situation in the Mideast. We have Donald Trump as recently as a few days ago saying that he will be visiting Jerusalem in order to help confirm its transition into the new capital of Israel. And the reason that's important is it's a divisive issue. There are people that don't want Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel. While that is not the center of the Mideast conflict right now, we have recent developments where you have Saudi Arabia basically looking like it's positioning itself to draw us into a war with Lebanon. Gennady, you can talk about that later. But for right now, Jeff, let's take a look at this, how this part represents the whole, or how this one action that's expected to go down on Wednesday reflects the greater situation and the balance of power and interests in the Mideast.
All right. I actually think this is an example of Donald Trump choosing a sort of moderate, non-offensive position to balance out competing interests in a way that a normal politician would. Which
what?
Is, yeah. There you go. He's balancing interests and choosing a moderate position and trying to remain non-committal. And it's just so rare with Donald Trump to hear him act like a normal politician. So let's get. That everybody's treating it like it's actually him doing something radical just because we're used to that story.
So radical non-stupidity.
Right, exactly. He's acting like a normal politician here. So let's start with what in fact is the norm on Jerusalem. So there are three kind of mainstream positions that exist all over the world. The first is that West Jerusalem is part of Israel, East Jerusalem is part of Palestine. In other words, the 1967 border matters, which is basically the border that was established between the battles between the Haganah mostly, and later the IDF during the 47 to 49 war, and Jordan. So where the army stopped, that's the border. And countries like China and Norway are the big advocates of that kind of position. The second is the traditional position, which came out of the League of Nations and the British Mandate, which is that Jerusalem should be an international city, separate and distinct from either the Jewish city or the the Jewish state or the Palestinian state that was going to be established. That's the position of places like the UK or the Vatican. And then there's the ones that support the idea that, look, at this point, everything in this region is going to be decided as part of the negotiations. The status of Jerusalem should be part of that, and that's the status of countries like Canada, France, and Italy. The only country in the world that right now fully, absolutely, and totally recognizes Israel's sovereignty over all of Jerusalem is Vanuatu. Greece, Spain, UK, and the US have consulates in Jerusalem, so they recognize at least some presence. The US policy has since 1995 been completely divided. Where Congress has officially recognized Israeli sovereignty over all of Jerusalem, and the State Department rejects the claim that Congress has the authority to do that. It has been a contentious issue in U.S. politics since the early 90s, when and particularly when this passed, that presidents are not recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, even though it is clear-cut U.S. law. What Trump is doing, Trump came into office like most U.S. presidents, promising, I'm going to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but that's a big break with a lot of countries and could potentially start a lot of trouble for no particular advantage to the United States. So it's something that the State Department has opposed for good reason. He backed down a little bit, and I think this time around he would have to back down again. But rather than admit that he's backing down, what he's doing is he's making a minor shift in policy where he's going to recognize Jerusalem as the status of as the capital of Israel without actually recognizing what the borders of Jerusalem are. So he's going to switch over to more or less the Chinese and Norway position, which is a mainstream position. So he's moving from one mainstream position and sort of divided to potentially another mainstream position and divided. And while it's a change in policy, it's well within the mainstream, and this is a lot of hysteria, in my opinion, a lot of hysteria over nothing.
While Donald Trump is doing that and taking this position, it looks like also the Saudi Arabia is taking this action that looks like it is increasing the likelihood of their conflict with Lebanon, which it seems some would say inevitably draws the United States into conflict there, possibly meeting Russia head on somewhere, either maybe in Syria. What's the balance of interests in the region? And tell us about what you think the likelihood of imminent war is there, and then anybody can jump in. We'll talk about what we think the prospects of war are there.
One of the things I also would love to hear you talk about is I'm pretty sure. I mean, I'm looking at a map here, and I don't think Saudi and Lebanon share a border, so they got to go through somebody else or around. And I don't think Saudi Arabia has that sort of amphibious capability.
Yeah, that's what.
I mean, am I misunderstanding something? So if you could just throw that in, as part of your follow up there. I've been hearing this as well. I don't see how they get there.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, absolutely, I will. So let me deal with all the same players when we talk about Syria, which excludes the United States, and I'll hit the United States at the end. The shift to Pompeo is potentially a game changer. Both Saudi Arabia and Israel would be absolutely thrilled for the United States to go to war with Iran. So we would have their full backing. Up until now, we have said no. So let's handle the same players and what they want. So first of all, there's Iran. They've been involved in the Syrian war for the last 6.5 years, basically with the Iran al-Quds forces and Hezbollah. They've done an airlift of weapons. They recruited tens of thousands of Afghans who are Sunni to fight with the Shia militias, and they've extended billions of dollars in credit to keep the Assad regime afloat. So they have fully backed Assad in the regime, and they have won. What they want to do is they want to cash in. They want four things: mining concessions, air bases, and a military port. I'm sorry, three things, and a military port on the Mediterranean coast. Two of those three, the mining concessions and the airbase, are not actually controversial with Israel. The military port would be controversial, and military air bases would be. And that is what Israel is threatening war over. So the interesting thing about this that I haven't seen covered very much in the US press is there's actually a pretty obvious compromise here, which is that Iran gets 70, 80% of what they want, and Israel's not upset about that in the slightest. Moreover, Iran has basically said that they're perfectly okay with that because, their feeling is that a military confrontation with Israel threatens all the stuff that they gained out of the Syrian war, while getting 80%, without risk is safer. Now, their preferred policy right now is to distract Israel by stirring up trouble in Gaza, not to try and avoid the confrontation rather than to make concessions. And I'll move on to that next. The Gaza Strip is controlled by a group called Hamas, which most people have heard of. They took control in 2006 and have been under a military closure, basically a blockade. They share a border with Israel, and they share a border with Egypt. Egypt, because they sided with the Muslim Brotherhood, has been pretty tough with them, the military dictatorship, and has kept that border relatively closed. And effectively, both countries have been putting them under economic pressure. Egypt has agreed to take the economic pressure off in exchange for Hamas sort of working with the Palestinian Authority and ceasing to be the leadership of Gaza. That is absolutely Hamas's number one objective. So they have basically told Iran, go pound sand. We do not want a war with Israel. We want an open border with Egypt. You can't deliver an open border with Egypt while you can send us nice missiles and some money and some, whatever. We're not doing it. So there also is the issue, of course, that in an actual situation with Iran, Israel could choose to just ignore Hamas's provocations and go after Iran. And Hamas, by the way, has done this on the ground. Islamic Jihad was supporting the Iranian position, and Hamas cracked down on them very hard. So all indications are that Hamas has told Iran, go pound sand. Egypt has two big problems going on right now. They have a coup, which is causing an economic downturn, and they are having the problems with ISIS. In other words, when ISIS was kicked out of Syria and Iraq and other places, it's moved into the Sinai. They're also having economic problems because Saudi Arabia has been less supportive of Egypt as they've become less anti-Iranian under the more moderate Sisi government. So their foreign policy goal is to focus on their domestic insurgency in the Sinai and not get into more trouble with Iran. They want to stay neutral. Okay, now Saudi Arabia. I'll answer Fred's question. Because the issue is from Egypt, if they're not going to play the leadership, who's usually the typical leadership of the sort of Sunni alliance, then Saudi Arabia is sort of the number 2 guy and they take control. Okay, Saudi Arabia, you're right, does not share a border with Lebanon. They're not.
I'm sorry, one interjection there. I mean, regarding Egypt's, so-called desire to remain like somewhat neutral in this very tense situation, I would add that they're currently negotiating with the Russian government to, reinstate military base options there for Russia. So that would be a significant, I don't want to call it an escalation, but that is a material change in their
and
regional
use
policy.
of their airspace for military purposes.
I believe also military bases. They're discussing concessions as well.
Using airspace for refueling and all the other stuff. That's what they're the deal is almost completed between Russia and Egypt.
Right, and I think that signifies, obviously Russian reassertion of control there, obviously, which they lost in, I guess, was it the early 1970s. But anyway, all right, sorry.
That is an excellent point. You're right. I'm not covering Russia's play here. If Russia helps Egypt deal with their insurgency, that would be fully consistent with not taking a hard line on Iran. My main point is Egypt doesn't really particularly want a hard point in Iran, neither does Russia. So that doesn't from the standpoint of the Iranian issue, doesn't change anything. Next one is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia has just gotten basically their butt kicked in Yemen by the
crazy,
Iranians.
right?
Huh?
It's crazy, right? I mean, if you'd asked to handicap that bout a couple of years ago, you'd say that the Saudis would just run rampant, or at least I would have.
They would too. They would too. Actually, this is what's caused the recent coup, basically almost coup in Saudi Arabia. So they've lost a lot of influence in Iraq. They've lost a lot of their influence over. There is now Iranian dominance in Iraq. There was domination in Syria, and now there is Iranian domination in Yemen. Their belief is that Iran is an expansionist military power. It's a clear threat to all Sunni Muslims. This is not just rhetoric. This is the core of their foreign policy, stop Iran. On the other hand, they also realize that having lost to the Houthi rebels, they can't afford to get into a full-on border thing where they, attack Iraq or attack, or go full into Iran with their military power. They'd lose. Mohammed bin Salman is the leader of Saudi Arabia, is disgusted with the performance of his military, and actually purged people because his feeling was that this was a result of corruption, that the damage to the military was by this corruption and incompetence was simply unacceptable.
Is that the sole motivation for all that house cleaning that was happening a couple weeks ago, where there was I don't know. It looked like the end of one of the Godfather movies where simultaneously the Godfather goes and kills all these competing rivals all at once and suddenly becomes the head. It looked like that, where there's this, helicopter crashes, jailings, killing. So is that the only motivation behind all of that consolidation of power, or was there more to it?
Well, I think you could say there's more to it in the sense that he thinks that the corruption and the incompetence needs to stop, and the sort of genteel leadership of the House of Saud, the House of Saud, where you've got this divided royal family that controls everything in a kind of consensus and sort of do your own thing kind of way, is no longer acceptable. That Saudi Arabia needs to become a tighter, more organized government to hold itself, and that it's let itself become sloppy in a world where the United States is not, really standing up for it. If I were going to say, what was the thing that blew them away, it was their loss in Yemen. They could, like Fred was saying, they couldn't believe they lost the Yemen war. It is a sign of just sheer incompetence and how bad their situation has gotten. And they're reassessing themselves and saying, okay, we really have serious problems in our government.
But I think elements of that government as well have been able to take advantage of this sort of internal distress, if you will, and manipulate it for their own purposes. The House of Saud is enormous. There are tens of thousands of members of that family. Some of them very influential, and some of them, even their own family members hardly know about them. But I think when you got this Salman there, he was able to use all this in and really start to engineer what really, I mean, smells like a coup to me. I mean, it's a soft one for sure. It's a big deal. It's a big deal in the region.
So, Jeff, as you continue to delineate the interests of power here, how does this war with Lebanon fix or solve anything?
I'll get to that in a moment.
All right.
Actually, that was literally the next point I was going to make.
Okay.
Or second to next point I was going to make. Right. Yeah. So I'm two away from it. Sorry. And I know this is a long story, but this doesn't get covered well in the U.S. press, like treating all these people as rational actors who have their own interests.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So what Saudi Arabia has concluded, given that they're militarily embarrassing at this point, and Iran is a major threat, that they need a major military power to lead the Sunni camp. Egypt's not available for the reasons we already talked about. Mm-hmm. So they decided on Israel, which is a little odd, of course, because, Israel's not run by Sunnis.
When you say decided on Israel, unpack that for me. What does that mean?
In other words, they believe that the best strategy for the Sunni Muslims is that Israel be the point of the spear in terms of confronting Iran and take a leadership role in the Sunni camp, which is, a major change in policy. They're being invited into a military alliance in a leading position. Their big issue, of course, is that Iran and Israel are really far apart. The place where they would likely battle is something like Syria and Lebanon. Israel's not necessarily all that interested in going to war, 1,000 miles away across with Iran either. But they are interested in pushing Iran out of Syria and to a certain extent out of Lebanon. So that's an achievable goal for Saudi Arabia to get them to fight Hezbollah and destroy Hezbollah. So when you talk about, when Fred was asking, what is the border that they want to use with Lebanon? It's the border between Israel and Lebanon. That's the border they want to use.
Is it not a question of almost metaphysical certainty that any war that Saudi Arabia starts is going to wind up dragging the U.S. in there because they don't have any? Because their military is sort of at 6s and 7s, and as you said, they're
absolutely.
I would disagree. No, I would say no. I mean, I think Yemen disproves that. We mostly, we were involved in Yemen in terms of counterterrorism. We let Iran win. Similarly, Saudi Arabia was backing ISIS. We were on the other side.
Gennady, your position quite clearly is that the inevitability of conflict of Saudi Arabia initiating this conflict and the way things are going today is that the United States will inevitably be drawn in.
Lebanon will be a secondary theater of action. I don't want to get into the domestic Saudi Arabian situation and corruption. All this is, to me, it's the struggle for power. Ultimately, what underlies it all is who is going to manage the shop in the Middle East.
Okay, wait. Are you talking? You're speaking regionally now. You're talking about the struggle for power in the region, not just in any particular.
It has to start with a region. Because since the Iranian Revolution, the Middle East was not managed really by anyone. I mean, Iran for a long time under the Shah was the power there, and we backed up Iran, and things were more or less normal. Now it's all up for grabs in the situation in the world where regional powers are becoming prominent, like China and Russia and whatnot. Instead of the international organization. So there is a real question. Who is going to manage the shop in the Middle East? And there are two candidates for it. Iran is the one who has very strong presence in the Middle East, who has good army, and his, Revolutionary Guards. They're really well prepared for this. So they have positions in many places in the Middle East. And then there is Saudi Arabia, which we all know has very small army. Practically, I don't even know how to characterize. The Air Force is strong in Saudi Arabia. The Air Force is good. It's all equipped by the United States, and it is capable of doing some pretty serious operations. But the ground forces are nothing. So my scenario is this: they already declared that the missile launched from Yemen or from some other place, I don't remember where from, in the direction of Saudi Arabia is an act of war. So here it is. They already declared that there is an act of war. What is the likely next thing will happen? There may be another rocket launched from somewhere in their direction. to which they respond by a massive airstrike, to which the Iran will respond by ground operations. And that puts a threat on American bases. And the United States is not. By the way, Trump traveled to Saudi Arabia, promised them something like 100 billion military equipment. I mean, so some astronomical figures. Of course, probably 10% of this would get delivered. And the connection between the United States and Saudi Arabia is very important.
Well, let me just interject. Saudi Arabia is not exactly toothless here. They have, like, I don't know, 800 aircraft, thousands of tanks and armored fighting vehicles. I'm just looking at a list here. 5,472 armored fighting vehicles, 790 aircraft, 177 fighters. So that speaks to the strength in the Air Force. They have 55 naval assets, including 7 frigates, corvettes, patrol craft. So they're not. It's not like they're sitting there saying, "Help us." They're fully capable of going out and killing a ton of people.
Their army is 250,000 people that, according to the experts that I read, is not battle ready. They're not going to stand up against the Iranian army. They're not, the boots on the ground there are not going to match what, only the United States can match that.
I'm totally with Grenady on that one. The Saudi ground forces have sort of long been sort of a pet project of a number of the different princes, and they don't have the kind of fighting capabilities that the Iranians do. Again, though, these guys would either have to be scooting back and forth across the Gulf, or they'd have to go through Iraq and Kuwait to get there. So when you're talking about boots on the ground.
To get to where?
Well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were positing that there'd be sort of a missile or airstrike exchange between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that would lead to boots on the ground. Did I misunderstand?
Yeah.
So in order to put those boots on the ground, like Iranian boots in Saudi Arabia, you've got to go through 2 sovereign countries to do that.
Okay.
Right. So unless you're talking about some sort of Iranian Schifrin plan, then they've got to go swimming across the Gulf, and that's really not viable. So are you suggesting that there'd be some sort of a missile or airstrike exchange, and then the Iranian army would go through Iraq and Kuwait to get to Saudi Arabia? Because if you're suggesting that, I would say that's not a possibility.
Well, first of all, there's another part to this equation. Okay. At the same time, if the United States get committed to support Saudi Arabia, it will draw Israel in. So Israel will go to Lebanon to clear the Hezbollah.
Okay, sure,
but statements to this effect.
I still need to know before we get Israel invading Lebanon as part of a proxy Middle Eastern war. I still need to know that what you're saying here,
I hear you.
Iran is going through Iraq and Kuwait to get to Saudi Arabia.
I think Iraq will cooperate with Iran.
Okay.
I think Iraq, Shia of Iraq, will work with Iran.
They have been working with Iran for years.
Yeah,
right?
no. I know they've been working together, but this is something entirely different. Iraq has a first-hand experience with the kind of mess that the American military can make. I mean, we have a big military, and we can make a huge mess in a country like that.
In Iraq,
I don't think the Iranians or the Iraqis, especially not the Iraqis, but I don't think the Iranians want to do that. I mean, I think the exposure they have, the level of risk they have in an actual ground combat is beyond the pale. I mean, it's literally. I cannot conceive of a situation.
Guys, can I interject here? I'd like to just kind of maybe circle back here. Let's look at this from the perspective, excuse me, of what the U.S. policy position might be in light of this very complex, web we have, and Fred, to your point, exactly, when we look at this and we see a scenario where potentially the United States could become engaged, yet again in another intractable, meaningless war with no clear strategic goal in the Middle East. I think that from my perspective, the correct way to look at this in terms of at least from the U.S. policy perspective would be, okay, yes, we acknowledge that Iran obviously has been attempting to expand its hegemony first in Iraq and now through Syria, where effectively it has a very strong command and control structure already set up in Syria. Russia is now involved, supporting its former, client state, Syria, trying to engage in Egypt. So you have kind of this balance of power scenario where you have the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and then you have kind of Iran and Russia sort of vying for influence, in particularly in the Syrian theater. But when we step back and we look at why are we involved in the Middle East from the American perspective, what is the relevance of our engaging in this region, which is just this endless, multipolar, scrum going on for the past, for decade after decade, with no end in sight of any real resolution of having some sort of rational, normal,
there are two
power
answers.
sharing structure. What I would say is
there are two answers to this question.
Right. So I think that from the U.S. perspective, we're looking at declining petrostates and the former client states of the U.S. and the Soviet Union all vying for control in the region. The U.S. policy over the next, say, 10 to 20 years, I realize no one looks that far in advance, it will most likely be one of disengagement from the region as the role of petroleum in the global economy begins to diminish. So I think that's, from my perspective, I would argue that the lowest risk policy for the United States would be to engage in a balance of power policy, if you will, where we have maybe limited military engagement when necessary, but essentially a policy to limit and stymie Russian and Iranian dominance over the region, Russian or Iranian dominance over the region, and just kind of maintain the current balance. Because eventually, as the economies deteriorate, these are all decline, Iran, Saudi, any oil producing country is going to be in decline. They are in decline as we speak, and they've been in decline as we can see from fiscal issues. So I think the U.S. should be disengaging from the region over an extended period of time. But in the meantime, the goal should not be to go in, as Fred said, we tend to go in guns blazing with no clear objective defined, and then we end up destroying a country. Perhaps the appropriate policy would be to just check and balance in the region to prevent any one of these players from gaining too much control. And I think eventually it will resolve itself out.
Well, I think what matters is that Jared Kushner's vision for the Mideast, and can he bring peace here that way? Jeff, does it look like the Kushner policy is to do exactly that, or was there more to your theory that you wanted to advance?
Yeah. Let me get into Hezbollah, I guess. As far as Jared Kushner, I don't think he has. He basically is part of the Netanyahu wing as far as what their thinking is. So if you guys don't mind, I'll cover what Saudi Arabia is doing, go to Hezbollah's position, and then jump into Israel and address the issue of why would Israel be willing to do this. And all right, so basically the Saudi plan is, once you've accepted that they're going to use an Israeli proxy, I think we're all on the same page about that. Saudi Arabia is not powerful enough to invade Iran, go through Iran, and attack Iraq. Invade Iraq, go through Iraq to attack Iran.
Not feasible. It's
right,
not
exactly.
feasible.
It's not right. It's not militarily
and
feasible.
the only decent highway goes through Kuwait. You'd have to, again, either Kuwait would have to team up and make a little mini alliance.
Kuwait would team up and no problem. They're on the team. They wouldn't. They're on the team, but on the other hand, they don't want to necessarily be the location of a gigantic battle between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Meanwhile,
that's not their goal.
Right. They're on the team, but to what extent they're on the team, that's a lot to ask. So basically, what they've said is, all right, we're going to destroy Hezbollah. That is a major that would push Iran back. They have a viable way to destroy Hezbollah. And so this whole thing about Lebanon and declaring war and all that stuff is basically they wanted to get Prime Minister Harari out of the country. They don't want the Harari clan harmed politically, while Saudi Arabia engineers an Israeli invasion of Lebanon. They don't want him to be responsible. They want Hezbollah to be responsible. So what they're sort of saying to the Sunni leadership is, you guys obviously can't betray your own country, so don't be in power at the time, because we're playing hardball here. Okay, Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah, this is one of the pro-peace or most pro-peace force around for this. They've gone through 6 years of conventional warfare. Unlike sort of the terrorism and resistance operations they were engaged in before. They've had to use advanced weaponry that they got from Iran. They've had to do command and control military formations to operate against ISIS. Those have been as large as a brigade. They are now an army. They are no longer, by any stretch of the imagination, a terrorist organization or anything like that. They are an army. They also were able to maintain conscription within the Shia community in Lebanon. This is something that did not get much play in the U.S. press, but they had conscripts, which is, clearly acting in the role of a government. They have, however, lost a quarter of the people who were in their organization in terms of the people that were there 6 years ago. They've taken very heavy losses.
Is that only on the top, or would that be?
No, that's all the way down.
The total
all
population.
the way down. The bureaucracy, the low level, across the board. If you look at Hezbollah membership that were in the organization 6 years ago, a quarter of them are dead. So, this has not been a cost-free war for Hezbollah. Now, 6 years ago, there was some discussion about, how strong was Hezbollah relative to the Lebanese army, and most people felt that the Hezbollah was substantially stronger. Today, it's not even worth discussing. Hezbollah is so dominant over the Lebanese army, they could easily take the country. However, they still have many forces tied up in Syria handling, piecemeal issues with various Sunni groups. So they're still actively in that war. They don't want a war in Lebanon. They're busy in Syria. And for that reason that they're tied up, they're much weaker today than they would be in 18 months. Also, politically, they're much weaker than they were 6 years ago. 6 years ago, Lebanon viewed them as the resistance that drove out the Israelis. Now they're viewed much more as holding the country hostage in service of Iran. In other words, they got Lebanon involved in a major war, which is creating enemies to it for Iran's benefit, not for Lebanon's benefit. Also, there is a big issue that they have just been slaughtering Sunni civilians to keep them under a Shia dictator, which hasn't helped their PR with the Sunnis. So that's a big break for them politically. Saudi Arabia is basically more or less willing to say that Sunnis hate Shiites more than Jews. That is terrible for Nasrallah's long-term interest. So he is really working very hard to avoid a situation where Saudi Arabia openly sides with Israel against Hezbollah. So what he's doing as much as possible, he's being quiet, he's not being belligerent, he's trying to be appeasing, he is trying to avoid things. He understands very clearly that strategically, if Israel is going to attack Hezbollah anytime in the near future, now is a great time to do it, and he doesn't want this war. He gets that it would rehabilitate his image. That only works if it's a limited war. If it turns into a major war where there's hundreds of thousands of refugees and cities destroyed and all of that sort of thing, then the idea would be that Hezbollah is causing the Lebanese to suffer for the benefit of Iran. Politically, that might basically eliminate any ability for Hezbollah to ever take the country and hold it in a with consent of the government. While the Syrian government has been trying to do various minor provocations with Israel to see, rhetorically and so forth, Hezbollah has not been supporting them on that. They're very much along the lines of, no, we want to keep the border peaceful, we don't want to expand, which is a weird change because normally Hezbollah tries to be provocative. So finally, Israel. Okay, so right now, Israel was a couple weeks ago when Saudi Arabia was, doing things. Israel was hosting a 7-country military exercise, so it was not a good time to start a war in November. The question is should we start a war in December? So on the pro side, in terms of Israel, they get to be part of a military alliance. The more open this military alliance is, the more Arab leaders are meeting with Israelis openly and clearly, and it's in the newspaper, and they're talking good stuff about Israel, the better that makes it. Those are diplomatic concessions. It's really important. That is a major, major advantage to Israel, almost regardless of whether they win or lose the war. Israel doesn't want the permanent Iranian military bases in Syria. And that is an achievable military objective. There's no question that if Israel pushes in with a large number of troops, given the relative strength of Iran and Israel, they win. So those bases are gone. And it is very unlikely that Russia would stop. If there's something like 50,000 to 200,000 Israeli troops moving in there, that Russia is going to shoot at them, because again, that's either a major war for Russia, or they back down. They don't have anywhere near enough forces to stop them. So yes, Israel could simultaneously take on the Russian forces, the Hezbollah forces, and the Iranian forces in Syria and win fairly easily. They also understand that the situation on the ground, that Hezbollah is temporarily weak, that their problems with Hezbollah will be worse in 18 months. So again, if they want to destroy Hezbollah or take on Hezbollah or weaken Hezbollah, now is a good time to do it. On the anti-side, Netanyahu really, really dislikes war as a way to resolve diplomatic problems, because it ties up his options. Netanyahu thinks of himself very much as a short-term strategist and an expert at short-term strategy. The decision to go to war kind of locks you into a long-term strategy. You can't make minor tactical decisions. You're now committed. He's much more of a fan of belligerent rhetoric and pinpoint attacks. He thinks that war is very unpredictable, and he's not thrilled with the idea that the Saudis, basically get Israel to fight their war for them. However, I would say that my belief is, from my read of Israel, that there is no question there is a debate in Israel about starting a war, and the way you can tell is that they've gotten quiet. When normally there's all kinds of belligerency on the Israeli side about Hezbollah and Lebanon and Syria and the military bases and all kinds of rhetoric. There's none of that from the leadership in the government. The government is quiet right now, and that means that this is a serious conversation.
Note the missile exchange that took place 12 hours ago. I think the Israeli Defense Forces fired a bunch of missiles into western Damascus to hit Iranian bases there. So I don't know if you guys saw that news flow.
No, I didn't actually. That's a good point. That may be that I would agree that that's
so what is it?
They're keeping quiet. Thank you.
Yeah. Quiet. We're launching missiles. Shh, tell no one. So Jeff, do you what is that? How does that fit into your model there? So they're done discussing. Are they putting the gloves on?
No,
what does that mean?
200,000 troops. That's that is still diplomacy. In other words, they're sending a message to the Iranians: we are not going to tolerate military bases. Remember, there was an obvious compromise going way back up to when I started this. The obvious compromise is the Iranians get their mining concessions, they get their civilian airport, they get their civilian port, and then they've got a deal. Then Israel says okay, and Saudi Arabia is kind of left out to hang unless they want to up the ante with Israel. Like I said, there is a one of the reasons I don't believe there's going to be a war is there's an obvious compromise that both sides know is a compromise. They may, what I mean, they may not like it, and they may think maybe I can figure out some way to get around it and get something better, but there's an obvious compromise here. So I would say no, this is still diplomacy. So basically, what I would say is that Saudi Arabia can have this war if they really want it. If Saudi Arabia were to announce that the new Saudi Arabian ambassador to Israel is going to be opening the Saudi Trade and Cultural Center in the newly recognized Israeli East Jerusalem, you got 200,000 Israeli troops in Israel tomorrow, in Syria tomorrow. That would do it. And if you think about it, it's all symbolic stuff. It doesn't cost Saudi Arabia anything.
It costs them the respect of a lot of people in the Muslim world and their sort of leadership position in that.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
and I don't think that's just, I don't think that's nothing. I think that's kind of what they've staked their entire kingdom on. Maybe it's just me.
Well, I mean, I agree with you that, obviously these are diplomatic concessions. Otherwise, Saudi Arabia would have just made them. I mean, that being said, they are just diplomatic. The House of Saud used to be extremely anti-Jewish. They're not as openly anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish as they were. They have been moderating their position over time. I mean, going from moderating their position over time to, Saudi Arabian Cultural Center in East Jerusalem is, obviously that's not a mild shift, but they are asking for a war here. They're not asking for a minor policy concession. I'm just saying that there is a bribe that Saudi Arabia could give Israel that would get them their war. So it really comes down to how much does Saudi Arabia want this war? That I believe is the determining characteristic. I think on balance, Israel is likely not to do it. And Israel and Iran are likely to compromise, providing that Saudi Arabia doesn't up the ante enough. So that is, after we're all done, my take on how this plays out. Now, as far as the minor players,
but wait, even if they wanted the war, they couldn't exactly execute it without dragging us in. Is that right?
No, I mean, I think that like I said, they, do something like open the new Saudi Trade Cultural Center and with the Saudi Arabian ambassador. That gets them their war. They don't need the U.S. They can use Israel.
Well, that starts it, but I mean, ultimately, when Saudi starts, if we're to hold to the theory that Saudi is not prepared for that war, does the United States get drawn in by any of these players? If not Saudi.
I don't think Saudi Arabia gets drawn in. I mean, Israel kicks Iran's butt. Hezbollah is destroyed. Iran is driven out of Syria. The Russians cut some sort of a deal with the Israelis. The Israelis take the military loss and the expense of a war. I don't know that there's any reason that the Americans need to get involved. I mean, we might choose to get involved. That's, because we'd like to jump in on other people's problems all the time. But I don't know that there's any good reason that we would.
Policy would work because it would check Iranian influence, at least temporarily, if the Israelis spanked them for us. So frankly, that's probably the best option, because all we're really looking to do here, guys, is just prevent a sea change of hegemony in the region. I mean, from my perspective, I don't know if you guys would agree with that. I mean, we're not, what else are we really trying to do there?
Agree.
Great. So yeah, so
our
it's
long-term
good,
goal
so it's
is
a good
that
outcome
nothing
for
happens.
the Americans, that the Israelis take care of Iran. It's a cost-free war for the U.S. too.
Interject here something.
Yeah, go ahead.
If Saudi Arabia, if this is really about hegemony or control of the whole region, and Saudi Arabia, for whatever reasons, internal and external, wants to start this war, it can do so. It can do it. And it will draw the United States into this thing. And, the attitude of the Trump government is negative on Iran, is extremely negative. Now, how would the actual action, military action, develop? I don't know, because I'm not sitting in Iranian military staff somewhere, and I don't know what kind of plans they have. There are a zillion of plans probably they're getting paid for it. I mean, they get to make these plans. You can act through the sea, Qatar, Yemen. You can go through Iraq. There's a zillion of combinations. We don't know what they are. So if it starts moving into action, I think the war can happen. And the United States will be drawn in. I don't think Saudi Arabia has any army to speak of, and we will be drawn into a major conflict. Russia will certainly step in. Russian interest in the Middle East remains very strong. And the primary reason is Saudi Arabia, because all oil trade is done in dollars, petrodollars. Russia and China want to change that. They want to trade in yuan or some other currency. You see, it comes to the whole economic setup around the world, in accordance with which the United States gets subsidized by many international players. And they're tired of it. So this is really not just about the region. It also involves the rest of the world. And there are huge economic interests involved here. So if indeed it will happen, and I don't rely on Trump. These rumors that Pompeo suddenly becomes the Secretary of State is very troubling to me. Now they backed out of it. Trump said, no, this is really only a rumor. But, as Russians say, when there is smoke, there must be also some fire. I don't think that Trump would be opposed to, either wiping out or doing something to Iran to end its claims to hegemony in the region forever. Bombing it, exploding it, putting nukes on it, whatever. I don't know what he will do. Do you know what we will do in the case if there is a broad action? I support what Scott says. It's perfectly rational, and that's what I recommended too, that the United States should act as a mediating power. If there is a conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, you should turn it into a regional, local conflict, settle it. But then there is a fundamental issue remaining on the table: how to organize security system in this region and in the world, by the way.
There's a piece on that just came out 12 hours ago on the Hill. It says that President Trump's son-in-law, I'm quoting, the title of the article is "Kushner Holding Talks with Saudi Prince." It says President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner is engaged in negotiations with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, focused on creating a Palestinian state or territory. It says Trump has vowed to broker a peace deal between Israeli and Palestinians, a task that has eluded presidents with more experience in the region, blah, blah, blah. But Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is reportedly worried by the talks between Kushner and the Crown Prince. It says Tillerson is concerned that Kushner has not adequately shared the details of the talks and that negotiations could sour and stoke turmoil in the region. So on the one hand, we've got Kushner acting as a peace broker. Jeff, what's the likelihood of the United States settling the conflict between Israel and Palestine? And is there any sort of ancillary effect of stabilizing the Mideast even more as a result of that? What does that mean to you?
I think there's a reasonable likelihood that Saudi Arabia, let's say 20%, not huge, that Saudi Arabia can blackmail a boss into signing a completely unfair, one-sided peace agreement that Jared Kushner has written. All the details of it are that it is far worse than the Olmert plan. However, this peace agreement will not get the support of Hamas, will not have the support of the Palestinian people, will not have the support of broad Arab peoples. What it might do is legitimize it. I would say that blackmailing the Palestinians into signing such an agreement and thereby legitimizing Palestine as an Israeli colony, more or less, and Israel control over things like the Jordan Valley and Jerusalem permanently, that would be enough of a bribe to get Israel to fight their war for them against Iran.
How soon do you think conflict can break out, and how wide do you think it'll be? Just in a nutshell.
How soon do I think it could break out? I think that it could break out anytime. I think the Israelis, like I said, I think starting in November, they got serious about this. So you have Saudi Arabia is definitely serious about this, and Israel is definitely serious about this. How wide could it get? I don't think it can get very wide. I think that Russia ultimately will pull foreign forces out of Syria. They've hinted at that is an acceptable solution. I think Iran would compromise. I think Iran would try and throw in the towel in Syria. I think Hezbollah would, if there were reasonable concessions to be made, would probably do something that was publicly humiliating to avoid an all-out fight with Israel at this point. And it might just be that a show of sort of public humiliation would be, that looks like a win, would be enough for Salman. If not, then, there's going to be a war, but it would be a war between Israel and Hezbollah, and I think it would be fairly limited, that they would lose. The next one is, as far as Turkey and Pakistan, as you go further out, they both want strong relations with both Saudi Arabia and Iran. So they're going to push for de-escalation. I think that, they would see the potential for escalation and operate in the opposite direction. I just really see a situation basically where all the arrows are pointing towards a limited war at best.
Unless Saudi Arabia wants it. unless
No, and even with Saudi Arabia
wants
wanting it.
an all-out big war. I mean, they started the Islamic State and it failed. Now, and I don't know domestic situation in Saudi Arabia that well, but it seems that if there is a real culprit here, it's Saudi Arabia. They want an all-out war with the United States participating in it. They want to assert their dominance over the region. How they're going to do it, what's going on through Prince Salman's head, I don't know. But he seems like a very aggressive guy. He is purging the elements, some elements, we don't know what they represent. Maybe they represent a moderate opinion for limited pressure. But Salman definitely wants to act decisively, and that's what I'm afraid of. I'm not afraid of Iran. I think Iran is, moderately afraid of Iran. Iran prefers positional kind of action, moving slowly, gaining positions here and there. It's sort of playing a big sort of chess game. Saudi Arabia doesn't have that. I don't know how much room they have for maneuvering and what Salman is putting his stake on. But if you want to name a culprit if you want me to name a culprit in this area, it will be Saudi Arabia. It's a state that is internally weak, with failing monarchy, and it reminds me so much of the Russian monarchy that unleashed a war with Japan back in 1905 just to prop itself up domestically. And by the way, Russia also became involved largely in the First World War because of because of the critics within the country. The critics within the country were charging that the monarchy cannot protect them very well. And there is an Islamic sentiment within Saudi Arabia that points to the monarchs and say to the family, to the rulers of Saudi Arabia, saying they're not good, which I agree with. They're not good.
No, that's
They're
all
not
true.
good. So they really have to do something drastic to save the family, to save the type of rule that is unsustainable. What are they going to do? I don't know. It's hard. I can't follow Salman's head. I mean, okay. I got my spiel.
I agree with you on the Russo-Japanese analogy. The question is, how do they get the United States involved?
Well, first of all, Trump is a bit irrational. I grant you that. He's a bit irrational. He's a kind of a dealer who shoots off the hip. And it may appear to him that if he sends a bunch of airplanes and they will bomb a few mountains in Iran will bend down and stoop and crawl on their knees. And that's not going to happen. And it's going to be a prolonged conflict. Who's going to be drawn into it? It's hard to say. I'm sure Russia will be there because they have interest in it. How is it going to play out? Who would say how the war was going to play out in the First World War? Nobody would say it. Everyone thought it would be brief, short, boom, bam, we're out, peace settlements are made, we sign the agreements and we go home. No, it lasted 4 years and 20 million lives. That's what I'm afraid is going to happen here. And I really point to Saudi Arabia. I think they are the culprit.
What is Gennady? What do you think would be the key instigator of that conflict? Then, I mean, if we were going to put the same question to you, how soon, how wide, and what would cause that?
This is why I started this petitioning and stuff like that, to send a very clear message to the Trump government that the American public, American people, do not want any major engagement in the region. So please stop Salman, negotiate and turn it into a regional local conflict, negotiate it, and then set up a security system. This is what we should do. Whether Trump will do it, it's your guess against mine. I don't know. I don't suspect that. I don't suspect that they even think in these terms.
I would concur. And I mean, I think that maybe we need for practical purposes to perhaps look beyond the foreign policy activities of the current administration, as things might be changing sooner than we think based on the current news flow. So what I would say is,
Is it
whoever
your theory
perhaps-
that it's hard to run a responsible diplomatic effort from jail? Is that what you're saying, or what?
I'll refrain from comment, but my point is that I'm looking at this more in terms of, the current, but also the next administration, because as Jeff and Gennady have said, like, it's just, there are so many moving parts here. There are so many unknowns. You've got declining U.S. power in the region. You've got declining, structurally failing petrostates from Russia to Iran to Saudi, all beginning, I don't want to use the word implode, but I would say, in a state of deterioration, perhaps over the medium term, if you will. So, to make the argument that it is in U.S. interest to militarily engage, beyond topical or limited strikes, in any of these countries is just, in my opinion, based on our previous, results in the region, in Iraq in particular, it is just not a realistic policy. There is no resolution, and there will never be a resolution to any of these issues, these very complex issues that Jeff and Gennady were alluding to, particularly in terms of regional Middle Eastern politics. I think that if the United States does not have a long-term economic interest in maintaining oil trade stability in the region, which we do not, because this is an energy source that will phase out over the next 2 decades. More or less, from the U.S. and OECD perspective specifically. So the question should really be, why are we engaging at all in this intractable region? The objective should simply be to maintain the whatever balance of power we can with the least amount of military with the lowest military fight or war risk outcome. That should be our policy, because to think that the United States government, State Department, intelligence agencies, military could in some way fashion a coherent policy that could bring together such disparate interests ranging from culture to religion to political orientation or what have you is completely unrealistic. And it would just be a complete waste of U.S. resources, in my view. So, not to sound isolationist, but I'm just saying that I think that we have to. The best policy would be a limited engagement policy to maintain the current balance of power, and just be sure that no single power maintains hegemony in the region over the next 10 to 20 years. I think that is the rational policy that the United States should engage in.
I agree with part of what you're saying, Scott, and I disagree with others. I think the United States is vitally interested in whatever is happening in the world. We need a peaceful world. We are interested we should not be in favor of war anywhere in the world, and we need to think about new security system that will do it. But that's an aside. I also think that Trump can willingly go into a major war in this region to strengthen his position.
His position to strengthen the U.S.
His personal position in the United States, because that, it somewhat reminds me of a second Iraq war and George Bush. You get into a war and you consult. Even Hillary Clinton voted for that war, for God's sake. If there is a major war, the nation will come around the president, and that's what he wants. That's what he wants.
Fred, how much of Trump's constituency wants him to start a war in the Mideast? Is it something like who does this serve domestically?
Yeah, who does it serve domestically? I honestly, I think it serves virtually no one domestically. I think Trump feels like he may want a war because I think Trump feels like it would help his domestic situation. But the only war that really benefits an unpopular president is either a war wherein the United States is subject to some sort of a dastardly attack, or the situation where it is a quick and decisive U.S. victory with no troops overseas. I think that's the kind of war that Trump wants.
And this would be neither of those.
He cannot get that with anything else in the Middle East. I think Trump is a fool in a lot of ways. but I don't believe that he or the military power structure has any hope of a quick and decisive victory in the Middle East, especially not against Iran. There's no capability for us to wage war effectively in Iran. Iran would make Iraq's 8-year debacle into something that was more carnival like. I think Iran is so much more dangerous than Iraq, and for the United States military to be committed in a place like that, it would be devastating. I think ultimately for Trump and for most of the Trump supporters, because to be fair, it's Trump supporters that have their sons and daughters in the military.
Fred, you're absolutely right. You're
Okay.
absolutely right,
Great.
but I agree with you.
Well,
But that's not
can we wrap up when I'm absolutely
Trump
right?
may very well say,
First, we're going to raise your taxes, then we're sending your children to war to die. Thank you
Right,
so much for
exactly.
your support.
Fred,
Vote for me.
it doesn't have to happen this way. He's sending a force to bomb all nuclear facilities in Iran. How about that? Can he do that?
I
Can he
mean,
do that? Of course he
no, because we don't know where they all are.
They'll find out.
Right? I mean, no, they won't. I mean, the Iranians are a little bit smarter than that. Plus, there's mountains in Iran, and not just one or two.
Are you sure you can vouch for it? That that's smarter than that?
I believe I can. I mean, we both know that we had quite a number of people at Bard who were very militarily connected with their families in mostly Pakistan. But I mean, these are not dumb people. They have put together a significant nuclear effort while under significant sanctions, and I think they can probably hide a bomb or two in one of their 45 million mountains or whatever they have. I mean, the North Koreans can hide the bomb.
That still should not stop Trump.
Well,
So Gennady, are you saying?
I
Are
think
you
it'll
wait,
stop
wait, Gennady? Are you saying that there is no force on Earth that will stop Donald Trump from?
No, that's not what I'm saying. No.
What are you saying?
I don't know what goes on through his head.
okay.
I can't say what goes on. Some of the signs indicate, for example, he recognizes Jerusalem as the capital, but he doesn't move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. No, he's wishy-washy. He's like, I don't know what goes on. Is he massaging the American public before he makes his decisive move? I don't know. They're preparing the population. I hear voices that indicate that they are trying to convey to me that Iran is a great danger, that Iran is the aggressor, and this and that, in which you create public opinion and then you put it on the table and you launch it, and everyone becomes responsible, not just George Bush, but the Congress and Democrats and Republicans, everyone. You can engineer it. I mean, he's a smart guy. He's savvy in these things. He's not going to move in and put his ass on the line. He's going to put everybody's ass on the line there. He's not going to do it by himself.
Fair enough.
I don't know. I just feel that I would rather err on the side of peace than on the side of war.
Well,
I
sure.
would like to have a clear statement from the American government. We're not going to support any major effort. I just want a statement on the table. Number one, we will make everything possible to turn this war, if there is a conflict, to turn it into a local conflict, to maintain it as a local conflict and negotiate it.
What would be the benefit to make such a statement, though?
I don't know. But then we're back to square one, and it's just everything is up in the air. So that I don't want to say what, but at least I would like the government to know that there is no consensus population-wise. There is no consensus in this country to support this war. That if they start the war, there might be demonstrations going on like during the Vietnam War. And with that, they would be at least cautious.
Well, that's an interesting.
Politicians tend to be irresponsible. Think of George Bush.
Go ahead.
Who would say that we will end up in Iraq for several years and fighting for Mosul or whatever else 15 times and, losing our soldiers there and then retaking it again and basically not succeeding. What did we fight for?
That's the whole point.
Can I
If we
spin on the Iraqi
succeed,
now? Go ahead, Scott, please.
if we succeed, we will leave. And then we will fail because the situation will return to exactly what it was before we entered. So there's absolutely zero reason for the United States to engage in this. But I do agree with you, Gennady. I mean, if, like, from my take, and this is the frightening and disturbing world we're in, is that if the U.S. President is at risk, as we're seeing it possibly unfold rather rapidly here, if his administration is at risk, then the concern is that he may engage in irrational or dramatic actions or risky actions in order to protect his own personal political power. So I would leave it at that and say that's probably my greatest concern in the coming months here.
Same here, Scott. Same here.
Exit question on a scale of 1 to 10. Donald Trump, 10 being metaphysical certitude, 1 being completely impossible. The odds of Donald Trump committing to the irrational position of initiating the war in the Mideast through proxy Saudi Arabia. Jeff.
Wait a minute. Through proxies? In other words, being happy with Israel as a proxy? Then 7. If it's actually U.S. troops, 4.
Fred? Fred, you there?
Yeah, that's I am. Am I not? Am I cut out?
No. I'm asking you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, 2. It's a 2. It's
2.
a 2.
Why?
I think it's basically unlikely. I don't think we've got the structure in place to really advocate for that sort of a war. I don't see it. I don't see it happening. I don't feel like it serves the interests of the countries at large. I think they gain more about bickering and talking about war and saber rattling for war than they do about actually prosecuting a war.
Scooter.
Based on the news flow of December 1st with respect to the Trump administration, I would say that the chance of unilateral action by the United States being initiated by the executive branch of government via proxies of either Israel or Saudi Arabia, I'd give it a 7 at this point.
Gennady.
Would stay at 7 too.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much for joining us.
There is a strong possibility. Okay.
Okay, everybody, thanks very much for joining us this morning. We're going to have to table the rest of our discussion about the Korean Peninsula conflict for later. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for joining everybody for listening to the McGrady Group.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.